In the book Mind and Life, I was really interested in trying to portray what I call the deep continuity of life and mind. And the idea there is really very much an outgrowth of what we were talking about before with the idea of sense making on autopoiesis. So that when you have life, life, especially understood in this autopoietic way, you already have mind or proto mind or the roots of mind. You have sense making. And then we can tell a story that lays down a path from the early and structurally more simple biological forms of sense making to then the more complex articulated ones biologically with multicellular organisms and animals, and then social life, and then humans with language and so on. So that's really what the book Mind and Life is about. And in order to tell that story properly, we have to do it in a way where we resist what Whitehead calls the bifurcation of nature. And that's this dichotomizing between subject and object, where we treat the things that we can objectify in physical mathematical terms as what nature fundamentally is. And then we treat the things that are how nature appears when a perceiver experiences it a certain way. So color, for example, we treat that as secondary derivative or not fundamentally real.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Chasing Consciousness. So today we have the important topic of embodied cognition to raise our awareness about. So the importance of our biologically lived experience to our perspective in the world. We're going to be getting into biologist and neuroscientist Francisco Varela's concept of autopoiesis, literally self-creation from the Greek, which describes the extraordinary tenacity of self-organizing living systems to create and sustain themselves. We're also going to discuss the meeting point of Buddhism, meditation, Asian philosophy, and modern cognitive science, which may have become slightly overstated in recent decades, and the deep continuity between body and mind, and the importance of the artificial separation of the objective and subjective in the history of science that's led us to the dominant position of reductionist materialism. To face these diverse topics, we have the hugely influential philosopher, cognitive scientist, and Asian philosophy scholar Evan Thompson as our guest. Evan is professor of philosophy at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver and an associate member of the Department of Asian Studies and the Department of Psychology. He's also a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. He's the author of many books, collected works, and papers, including The Embodied Mind, Cognitive Science and Human Experience, Life and Mind, Why I'm Not a Buddhist, and The Blind Spot, Why Science Cannot Ignore Human Experience, that we're going to be focusing on today. Now, I have been wanting to speak to Evan ever since his work was recommended by his friends and previous guests here on the show, John Bavecki in our discussion on collective intelligence, and Neil Thies in our discussion on complexity theory and self-organizing systems. So I just can't wait to get into this. So without further ado, let's go. Evan Thompson, welcome to Chasing Consciousness. Thanks for coming on the show. How are you today?
Good. Thanks for inviting me.
It's a great pleasure. Now, Evan, I love to start by asking my guests about their first burning philosophical questions when they were kids. But I think your story, particularly the story of your childhood, is a particularly extraordinary example for this question, because your father, William Irwin Thompson, was a philosopher and a poet. You were homeschooled at the retreat center and think tank that he founded with your mother, the Lindisfarne Association. His influences weren't so different from your own. So Vedic philosophy, the autopoietic epistemology of Francisco Varela, the philosophy of Alfred North Whitehead, self-organizing systems. I mean, just to name a few, there's a lot you have in common. So having had these really strong influences right from the start, and all these kind of incredible minds wandering around through your childhood at Lindisfarne, I imagine it must have colored quite a lot you're thinking at that time, and maybe even been a catalyst for your first thoughts. What jumps out when you look back?
Yeah, I was always a very intellectually curious and philosophically minded kid. And my parents tell me I don't have a clear memory of this. I have a partial memory of it. But my parents tell me when I was very young, at one point, I asked them, "Are we real?" And I would have been like 6 or 7, or maybe even younger. And we were at Disneyland in Los Angeles, and I was on some ride, that was like terrifying to a little kid. Oh, it was the underwater adventure where you go down in this like little submarine, and then there are all these sort of fake sea monsters and sharks that are lunging at you. And evidently, I was quite frightened by this, and my parents kept saying, "It's okay, it's okay, it's not real, it's not real, it's not real." And I turned to them and said, "Are we real?" And I don't have a memory of asking that question, but I do have a memory of going on that ride. So uh, I've always been concerned with the question, yeah, are we real? What's the difference between being awake and experiencing something, and having a dream and experiencing something in a dream? And these questions, led me into studying philosophy and religion and science. And I've just always kept going with the questions. I can't say that I've answered them, which is probably just as well, because once you answer them, then there's no reason to keep going, right? So,
Now, Evan, I know you and Francisco Varela and Elena Roche wrote the seminal book Embodied Cognition way back in 1991. So you must be a bit bored of talking about it. But the book and its 4E model of cognition and its connection to Buddhism have been so influential to that field that I just must mention them by means of setting a context for the listeners. So perhaps you can introduce the importance of this lived experience component and the 4E model that the book proposes, by telling us this beautiful story of how you met Varela, the Chilean biologist and neuroscientist at Linzmann, and what ideas that you found in common that drew you to work together on such an important book.
yeah, I met Francisco Varela. He was a neurobiologist by training, very philosophical neurobiologist. And eventually, although the word cognitive science wasn't quite so popular then, he eventually, became what we would today call a cognitive scientist, in the sense that he was a neurobiologist, but he was fundamentally interested in the nature of the mind. And I met him when I was 14 years old. He had been invited to a conference that my father organized together with Gregory Bateson, who was a very influential anthropologist and systems thinker in the 1970s. This conference took place in 1977 at the Lindisfarne Association, the organization my parents founded. And it was a conference called Mind and Nature. And this was while Gregory Bateson was writing the manuscript of his last book, which was titled Mind and Nature. And Francisco Varela was one of the invited presenters. It was a small gathering of people, basically to talk about the scientific study of the mind and the relationship between the mind and nature. And then Varela came and lived with us as a scholar in residence for it must have been about 6 months or so. So I was 14, 15 years old at the time, and he was a bit of a combination of an older brother, an uncle. He became a very close family friend. And I was at that point, I hadn't gone away to university yet. And so my interactions with him were just, kind of family around the dining room table conversations. But I was always interested in things having to do with the mind and science and biology. Francisco at that point had maybe for about 2 or 3 years become very deeply involved in the practice of Buddhist meditation. And so, I was raised in a setting where people practice meditation a lot. So there was that frame of reference, common frame of reference as well. And then some years later, after I had gone to university and gotten my degree in Asian studies, and then was in graduate school studying philosophy, I got very interested at that point in cognitive science. And it was a way, in part of reconnecting to interests I had had when I was a teenager through being exposed to people like Francisco Varela and Gregory Bateson and others at Lindisfarne. And Varela had at that point just moved to France and was setting up his lab in Paris. And he had given some lectures on the relationship between cognitive science and Buddhist meditation and philosophy. And he had money for a research assistant. He knew I had a background in the academic study of Buddhist philosophy. He knew I was now working in cognitive science. So he invited me over. This would have been the summer of 1986. He invited me over just to be a research assistant for a summer with the idea of turning the transcripts of these lectures that he had been given into some kind of, I think originally the plan was just to turn them into a paper, but in the course of working on them, they became, they ultimately became the book, The Embodied Mind, that was published in 1991. And Eleanor Roche, a psychologist at Berkeley, she became involved in the project sort of toward the end of the writing phase. I was on a postdoc at Berkeley at that point, and she was at Berkeley. And so the three of us really finalized the book together. And the book, although it was published in 91, it was really written, in those years of, say, 86 up through 90. And the basic idea of the book was that cognitive science was encountering the need to deal with mind as it is experienced, not simply as you might model or theorize about it, especially based on metaphors of the mind as being a computer, and that this raised questions about the nature of consciousness and the status of the self and the nature of action. And what we did in the book is we proposed an orientation or an approach to the mind that we called the enactive approach. And this synthesized ideas that had arisen with other thinkers in the 80s that thought that it was really necessary to understand the mind as fundamentally embodied and embedded in the environment. So these four E's, although we didn't use the term four E's in the book, that I think came out in the wider literature a little bit later. The four E's were embodied, so the idea that you can't understand the mind through disembodied models, like the idea of the mind as just a particular kind of software or computer architecture. So the relationship between the mind and the body as an intimate, intertwined relationship. The mind as fundamentally embedded in the environment. So cognition as fundamentally relational, having to do with the environment in which it finds itself and the way that it actually constructs an environment for itself through the body, through action. So embodied, embedded. Then, depending on who you ask, another E is extended. We didn't put it that way in the book, but it was implicit in some of the things that we said. The term extended really came into vogue through a paper that was maybe about 8 years later by Andy Clarke and Dave Chalmers, two philosophers of cognitive science. And their idea was that it's not just the case that cognition happens in the head and then there are external tools that we use. Depending on the circumstances, those tools can actually become part of the cognitive process itself. So, I mean, a very simple example, not their example, but one that goes back to older ideas in philosophy, is a blind person's cane is not just a sort of mere extension. It actually is incorporated, taken up into the body. So the importance of embodiment again, so that in and through and with the body, you feel the environment directly through the cane rather than it functioning as some kind of intermediary. So the idea of cognition as extended, emergent, that was an idea we talked about in the embodied mind, the understanding of cognitive processes as emergent through various kinds of self-organization involving the brain and the body, and again, external tools. And we summarized all of those ideas under the heading of this word enactive. And the fundamental idea of the enactive approach to cognition is that cognition isn't something that happens in an independent mind that represents an independent world. It's something enacted. It's brought forth in and through action so that mind and world form a relational structure that fundamentally involves the body as the, you could say, as the agent of active cognition. And that was the view that we proposed in the embodied mind. And then that view, the enactive view, has really taken off and been extended and elaborated and developed by a whole bunch of other people over the past 20, 30 years in all sorts of different areas. Yeah.
It definitely seeded like a massive inspiration to so many different people in completely different ways as well, which is quite interesting because obviously the Buddhist part of this is applicable in so many different ways. So I was wondering if you could just expand on the lived experience focus by telling us a little bit about this really important Varela Maturana idea of autopoiesis. I discovered your work through John Vervaeke, who often talks about you, Evan, and he mentioned you several times, and in particular autopoiesis, literally from the Greek self-creation. And I was hoping you could connect this idea, born quite a long time ago now with Varela, to this massive shift in neuroscience that we've seen really only in the last sort of decade or so towards the predictive processing approach. So this active inside out modeling of the world, rather than the old neuroscience paradigm of this sort of outside in paradigm of perception, sort of passively just receiving information about the world in an objective way.
Yeah. Well, with autopoiesis, that's an idea that actually predates the enactive approach that I was just talking about, and it goes back to the work of Umberto Maturana, who was Francisco Varela's mentor and then collaborator. Maturana was a neurobiologist, very, very pioneering neurobiologist who in the 1950s was responsible for major innovations in understanding how the visual system works. And he was studying that in terms of really detailed mappings of how the retina and the cells in the retina relate to subsequent areas of activity or processing in the visual stream. And that was at MIT. And then Maturana went back to Chile, and he formulated to himself the question. Well, he formulated himself two questions that he realized were really one question. So one question was, what is life? And the other question is, what is mind or what is cognition? And he realized that when you answered the question of what is life in terms of how does the system have to be organized to be living, you have given basically a specification of the organization that is also required for cognition. So the idea, this eventually gets called autopoiesis. So the idea is that the organization is a self-producing one, from the autopoiein, Greek words for self-creating or self-making or self-producing. And the simplest minimal sort of paradigm case of this is the single biological cell. So already, say, in a single bacterium, what you have is you have a complicated internal network of molecular processes that constantly regenerate and produce their own molecules that make them up. So you have a metabolizing, self-maintaining, self-generating, self-producing set of chemical reactions that also produce their own membrane boundary. And the membrane boundary makes possible the special internal environment in which all this self-production can happen. So that's basically the idea of autopoiesis. And what Maturana realized was that, and he's working in collaboration with Varela on this, is that when you have a system like that, it, as we subsequently later said, it enacts or brings forth its own world, its own domain of relevance in and through how it functions. So, for example, a bacterium differentiates on the order of 40 different species of molecules in terms of whether they are metabolizable and advantageous to its continued existence, its flourishing, or whether they are deleterious, toxins, and the bacterium will swim towards the ones that are attractive, as it were, and swim away from the ones that are repellent. And there's nothing inherent in the structure of the molecules, if you just looked at them as a physicist would, or even as a chemist would, that would indicate that they would have a meaning as attractive or repulsive. They have that meaning because you have a unitary system with an identity that relates to them in that way because of how it's built. And that would be the bacterium. So already there you have. Varela later would prefer to not use the word cognition here. He would say you have a kind of sense making. You have a kind of relevance that involves directional behaviors. The word sense in English means, meaning or significance, but in French it also has the sense of the direction of a river. So you have sense making, you have this kind of directionality and relevance, and that's fundamentally the root, biologically speaking, of mind, of cognition. So the emphasis then, so this becomes the theory of autopoiesis that Maturana and Varela develop as a way of understanding life and how a system has to be organized in order to be living, and then how, based on that kind of organization, you get complexifications with multicellularity and with evolution and development. And you could say that this is then an approach that puts the emphasis on the autonomy of the system, that the system, because of how it hangs together and how it needs to keep reproducing itself, so it hangs together in that way, that it, you could say, meets the environment from its own perspective, and out of the physical environment carves out or constructs a niche, an environment of significance. So the emphasis then gets placed on the active or inactive role of life and mind in sense making. Now, if we jump all the way ahead to neuroscience, Varela was very much, up until the end of his life in 2001, he was very concerned to take these ideas into the domain of eventually of human neuroscience, of understanding how the human brain works. And
Because what was his concern?
well, he was interested in the human brain as a very, very elaborate form of sense making, of biological sense making. So understanding the brain not as, so this connects to your questions about um,
Inside
the
out.
active inference and the inside out. Yeah. So the idea would be that the brain has its own intrinsic activity as an autonomous system. It's not a system that just responds to what comes in a feed forward way, because anything that arrives at the sensory surfaces, the eyes or the ears, there's already so much activity going on in the brain that whatever is done with that stimulus, or whatever that stimulus comes to mean, is going to be very much a reflection, not just of the physical characteristics of the stimulus or what's happening in the environment, but also what the brain is doing on its own terms, as you could say, as a result of its being this incredibly entangled, complex network that is made up of cells that have their own endogenous rhythms and that are talking to each other and that are creating oscillatory and synchronous patterns of activity. So it's as if you walk into a concert hall and you have this, music being played, and somebody says something in the audience, or shouts something in the audience. Well, that is going to have an effect on what you might hear as an observer, and it might perturb the players in the orchestra. But the orchestra has its own intrinsic ongoing activity, so that sound is going to, really be what it is in terms of how someone else hears it, because of everything else that's going on in the concert hall. So the brain, from this perspective, is like that. Whatever arrives in the form of stimulation has to be made sense of, given where the brain is in its ongoing activity. So now some people would say, so that means we have to shift from a kind of outside in to an inside out perspective. And so we see that today with talk about Well, reality is really like a kind of controlled hallucination. The idea there being, you know, when you perceive something, it's really just your brain hallucinating. It's just more controlled by the environment than when you fall asleep and dream and you hallucinate something. So that's actually not our view. That's not the enactive view, because from our perspective, that goes to the other extreme. So either an outside in or an inside out, those are both extreme views that lose sight of the dance of relationality between the brain and the world, the brain, the rest of the body, and the world. So in our view, that's a sort of overreaction to the insight that the brain plays this powerful creative role. But it is very much, you could say, an overreaction based on this idea that emerged with more and more prominence in the history of cognitive science through the 80s and 90s and into the 21st century, that the brain is this complex system with its own internal activity that plays a creative sculpting role in relationship to, or plays a kind of partner dance role in relationship to the environment.
Hmm. Okay, great, Evan. Now, more context. I think I need a little bit more clarification on the inactive E, because I feel like it's going to have more implications for the way we're going to talk about this artificial separation between the subjective and the objective, which is one of the main themes in your new book, The Blind Spot, when we get onto that in a moment. Now, I've understood that inactive is in some sense part of all the other E's, and also that it represents a dynamic principle of kind of exchange, change, sharing, allowing to be changed, interaction with the natural world. But for me, the real question is, for me, to what extent are organisms truly separate from or interconnected with the natural world? How does the inactive principle leave us when we start to think about the interconnection with the environment?
Mm-hmm. I would say that from the enactive perspective, what is really fundamentally important is the idea of, if we want to put it biologically, the organism environment relation as the unitary structure. That is, the environment is what it is as an environment because of the organisms that inhabit it, and the organisms are what they are as organisms because of the ways that they're fundamentally embedded in the environment. So if you lose sight of the relationality and emphasize one over the other, I mean, you might want to do that for certain purposes, for certain questions. It's not like, you can't do that, but you always have to remind yourself that you're dealing with a relational structure in which the glue of the relation is what we're calling an action. That is, that it's the process of activity that is part of the very nature of how the organism is put together, that brings forth an environment that in turn is necessary in this kind of circular way for the organism to be what it is. So it's like a partner dance. I mean, you can dance solo, you can go into a club and dance by yourself, of course, but even when you do that, you're sort of in a way dancing with the other people in the club. Or you can have, an actual partner dance where what you do is a function of what the other person is doing and vice versa, in a non-linear way where you have constant coupling, and the emergent activity is not a simple additive result of one person's activity plus another person's activity. So that's the basic idea of the organism environment relation in action. And what it means is that mind is a systemic uh, property or process. It's not that mind is in the head. That would be like saying flight is inside the wings of a bird. You need wings for flight. You need wings to generate lift, which gives you flight. So you need a brain in order for certain kinds of things to happen so that there's mind. But mind isn't in the brain. Flight isn't in the wings. Mind is the pattern of activity and relations that involves the whole person or the whole animal or the whole organism and its environment as a coupled unity.
And if we take an extension of Varela's idea of this membrane forming to the mind, and we look at this idea that the mind, in some sense, is forming membranes around itself, basically forming a self, a sense of separation from those things around it, to what extent, when we go beyond the impression of the self of autonomy, so important for survival, to what extent beyond that, when we look at the system as a whole, is it truly separate and autonomous?
Well, I would say that autonomy, in the sense in which I'm using the word, doesn't mean separate. You could say that there's no autonomy without relation and without dependence.
Certainly, Buddhism
Eh,
would say that. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and I think biology would say that as well. And the autonomy idea is, I mean, autonomy is a metaphor. So if we ask, well, what's the meaning of the word or the concept autonomy? Well, it literally means, self-governing or self legislating, giving yourself your own law. And that's a word that applies in the Greek to say the Greek city state, Athens, the polis Athens makes its own laws for itself. So it's autonomous. And then we take that as a metaphor, as we typically do. We take ideas that have to do with, human activities, and we use them as metaphors for understanding things in biology. And so the idea is that autonomy is a word that we use to express the idea that the organism, or the living being, the living system, is organized in such a way that it produces and regulates and maintains itself. So in a sense, it gives itself its own norms, its own laws. But of course, it doesn't do that in a separate, isolated way, because that would be impossible. It does that, I mean, concretely and thermodynamically. It has to take in matter and energy from the environment. And living beings come from other living beings. So there's, a history of reproduction and development, evolution. So life is always, the individual living thing is always embedded in this huge matrix of living beings that has this, massive historical depth back to the origin of life. So there's no separateness, but there is autonomy in the sense that we want to be able to describe how a living being like a cell organizes itself in a way different from, say, how a tornado or a cyclone or a hurricane organizes itself. I mean, those dissipative systems, as they're called in physics, they have a way that they are self-organizing and self-maintaining, but they don't do so by constructing and producing themselves metabolically in a way that alters the environment in a way that's to keep the system itself going in a precarious environment where it's in danger of always running down. So autonomy is meant to capture that kind of organization. The word autonomy.
Mm. This reminds me of the Buddhist concept of dependent origination and this idea that
Mm-hmm.
even the autonomous self is in a chain of causation that it is
Exactly.
inextricably unable to come out of, even from a perspective point of view, not just a perception. But we
Exactly.
mustn't get lost there because we're just setting the perspective, listeners. We're going to come back to Buddhism. Okay, so last bit of context, Evan, before we get on to deep continuity and the blind spot that I just can't wait to speak to you about. It's about phenomenology and neurophenomenology in particular, a term that you've coined. Can you just remind us what's your unique perspective on the way that you are arguing that phenomenology needs to be brought in to cognitive science, to neuroscience? And what is it that's what stopped that up until now? Why is this such a foreign idea to the majority of neuroscientists?
Yeah. So neurophenomenology is in a way a kind of outgrowth of the enactive approach. So the enactive approach gives us this idea, or these ideas that we've been talking about, of life as creative, life as self-making, and then in the case of human life, we have a situation where where the world is given to us in and through the different modes of experience that we have: perception and memory and anticipation and logical thought, all the different sort of modes of sense making, really, to put it in the most general terms, that we human beings have. We swim in those experientially. And if the scientific task now is to understand those, you hit a limit when you just look at them from the outside, when you just either look at the behaviors that they give rise to, or you try to capture a certain sequence of operations that might happen in thought or perception using a kind of computer model. You're not able to get at the fine-grained texture of those things as they are lived from within and experienced from within. So phenomenology is concerned with that. Phenomenology is concerned with, if we're now trying to understand consciousness, then an outside view hits a limit, because consciousness is fundamentally a phenomenon that involves the first person perspective, the perspective of experience itself in experiencing something. So phenomenology tries to work directly with that. And neurophenomenology is an approach to understanding, let's say, the role that the brain and the body play in experience, that looks to phenomenology in order to have much richer information than would be available if you didn't make use of phenomenology. But the trick there is that phenomenology isn't something that you can just sort of sit down and do with no training, as if it's just like an immediately accessible thing. Phenomenology, either in the philosophical sense or in the more pragmatic sense of how, as a first person, you are able to attend to your experience and describe aspects of it. That's something that takes practice and skill and training, and takes a second person working with you to help facilitate your own access to your experience. So neurophenomenology then sees the study of consciousness as really requiring the first person, second person, and third person perspectives all working collaboratively to understand experience and the mind. And historically, cognitive science has been averse to this, because cognitive science arose out of behaviorism in psychology, where you really talked about external stimuli and resultant behaviors and histories of reinforcement. And then when the computer model came along and said, okay, well, yes, but we need to take into account intervening processes, they were still described in an algorithmic way from the outside. And the idea was really, you can understand cognition fundamentally without ever saying anything about consciousness. Consciousness is maybe something you might take note of as sort of a, like, very late in the day epiphenomenon of some process that you can characterize in purely computational terms. But you don't really have to say much more about it than that. Well, the perspective of neurophenomenology is, no, you need actually an investigation from within, that it has to have its own rigor, but there needs to be a depth of investigation of experience from within. And that can actually be informative for the neuroscientist, because it can reveal things that otherwise would just get averaged out or treated as noise or insignificant.
Yeah, and this sort of first person experience, definitely there's a connection with Buddhism there. But we're just going to have to come back to that in a bit, or we're never going to get on to the main topics. So, all that context in mind, last brings us to the juicy bit, one of the biggest open debates in cognitive science, the occurrence of mind in life. This just happens to be the topic of your book of the same title, Mind in Life, clearly relevant to the embodied cognition story. Now, recently, I was privileged enough to speak with your co-author, physicist Marcelo Gleiser, about your new book, Together, The Blind Spot, Why Science Can't Ignore Human Experience, co-authored also with the astronomer Adam Frank. Marcelo explained some of the themes of the book, and one of them just jumped out at me, and I was desperate to ask you about it, because you're the philosopher of the trio of authors. Although they are both very philosophical scientists, listeners, you must check out their work, both of them. One of the blind spots discussed in this book is this bifurcation, I would say artificial bifurcation of our experience into objective and subjective. Now, we don't need to go into the history of science about why that happened. Both Marcello and Bernardo Castro have gone into detail here on the show about that separation that Galileo was obliged to make, more or less for his survival. The bifurcation did leave a legacy of reductionism, which essentially labeled the idea of top-down causal influence of the mind to the realm of sort of wishful thinking and woo-woo. Tell us a little bit about what you argue is a more well-balanced version of this bottom-up, top-down debate that led to your beautifully satisfactory deep continuity hypothesis.
Yeah, there's a number of things there. In the book Mind and Life, I was really interested in trying to portray or describe what I call the deep continuity of life and mind. And the idea there is really very much an outgrowth of what we were talking about before with the idea of sense making on autopoiesis. So that when you have life, life, especially understood in this autopoietic way, you already have mind or proto mind or the roots of mind. You have sense making, and then we can tell a story that that lays down a path from the early and structurally more simple biological forms of sense making to then the more complex articulated ones biologically with multicellular organisms and animals, and then social life, and then humans with language and so on. So that's really what the book Mind and Life is about. And in order to tell that story properly, we have to do it in a way where we resist what Whitehead calls the bifurcation of nature. And that's this dichotomizing between subject and object, where we treat the things that we can objectify in physical mathematical terms as what nature fundamentally is. And then we treat the things that are how nature appears when a perceiver experiences it a certain way. So color, for example, we treat that as secondary derivative or not fundamentally real. I mean, we're taught this in elementary school, high school science. We're taught that the rainbow is an illusion. What's fundamentally real are the particles of air and water, the light that is reflected. That's what's fundamentally real. Physics tells us what's fundamentally real, and the qualities that we experience are illusory. But if you're looking, was Whitehead's point. If you're looking at nature as a whole, as the cosmos, then color is just as much a part of nature as the fundamental physical particles. It's a part or aspect of nature that is there because there are perceivers, and perceivers belong to nature. Galileo tried to remove all the perceivers, and he had various reasons for thinking he had to do that. But ultimately, if you're going to give a unified account, you can't remove the perceivers. You have to as Whitehead says, you can't pick and choose. It all belongs to nature. So that means then that you need to look at nature as a system of relations without bifurcating it in terms of, here's the subject and here's the object. So in Mind and Life, I try to do that in a way that emphasizes this deep continuity of life and mind, that where you have life, you already have mind, and mind in its most articulated forms, you might say, always belongs to life. In the blind spot, the concern is really, it's related, but it's a different one. The concern is to say that that science has a blind spot where it loses sight of the need for direct experience in order even for it to get up and running and to proceed. And the bifurcation of nature is a form of the blind spot, because it basically says, oh, now we have this objectifying method, and the objectifying method tells us what's really real. And then you forget that the objectifying method actually depends for its meaning and significance on the kind of experience that underpins it. So the blind spot comes at the bifurcation of nature from that angle, and the mind and life concern with the continuity of life and mind comes at it from the angle of the unity of life and mind.
And what about this difference between sort of top down and bottom up? I mean, reductionism is definitely working with the idea that the fundamental is the particular, it is the smaller elements that come together in their relations to build these higher order functions. But then what about top down causes like electromagnetic fields or gravitational fields? These don't appear to be something you can reduce. Is there a more physicalist argument for why we need to look at things top down as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that we need to distinguish between reduction as a sometimes useful method where we look at complex phenomena or systems and we analyze them in terms of parts that we can isolate, at least relatively, shield parts from each other and look at their individual profiles, and then try to reconstitute and understand the whole in terms of the individual profiles. That works really well for things we build because we build them precisely according to those specifications. But it doesn't work so well when you're trying to understand systems that are living, that where you could say the whole is more than the sum of the parts, because the whole is a matter of how the parts, which aren't individual things but are actually processes, how they are interrelated in such a way that they generate a whole that in turn makes them possible in their individual profile. So you have this sort of tangled hierarchy of top and bottom, or whole and part. And we need different kinds of logics and mathematics and conceptual tools for understanding complexity that isn't bottom down reduction. And this is just within the domain of science, of complex systems theory, in science. It could be in physics, it could be in biology, but we need these other kinds of systems thinking tools. And even there, the words top down and bottom up, in some sense, they get in the way of their metaphors, because there really is no top and there really is no bottom, right? Like if you're faced with sort of a tangled mess of things, and if you intervene and cut it up in a certain way, then you get what you call the bottom. And if you intervene in another way, then you get what you call the top. But really, there's just an ongoing kind of dynamic intercomplexity of processes, and top and bottom are sort of metaphors for something that has the nature of a network. And
Mm.
that arises in all sorts of areas in science. Yeah. So reduction as a method is sometimes useful, but reductionism that says, okay, so when we apply the method of reduction, then we arrive at what reality fundamentally is. That then becomes a kind of metaphysics. You put an ism on the word reduction. This is the blind spot. Reduction is a method, works for some things, doesn't work for other things. You put an ism on it, you get a metaphysics. And what we call, following Husserl in the blind spot, the surreptitious substitution, that's the substitution of a method for a metaphysics.
Right. Or the map for the territory, or
Right.
the conceptual construct for the reality, which would be the Buddhist way of
Exactly.
looking at it.
Exactly. Right.
So, what does this mean for the origin of consciousness debate? Sorry, I know it's a big one, but
That's a
listeners.
big one. Yep.
So, I'm often struck by Galen Strawson's reasoning on this, that it seems more likely that there was a presence of proto consciousness of some sort somewhere in the ingredients from the start, than that there was at a certain point some magical jump from something that never existed to something that exists, from non consciousness to consciousness in evolution. Also, there's a frustrating move towards dualism as soon as we use this word of emergence, because for there to be something separate to emerge, it can't be one thing. It's something new that's emerged, and we get a dualism. Perhaps we can even apply this Strawson logic to the jump from non-life to life as well. I mean, what can deep continuity do to help us in this frustrating sort of magical emergence issue that we see both in the life from non-life debate and in the consciousness from non-consciousness debate?
Yeah. That's a really good question. I would say that I would say that all of these positions, dualism, panpsychism, physicalism, materialism, they are all uh, they're really all bifurcation of nature positions, because basically they already work with concepts of the mental and the physical that are the ones we get when we bifurcate nature. We get those concepts from, classically from Galileo and from Descartes, where the conception of what it is for something to be physical is that it's not fundamentally mental, and the conception of what it is for something to be mental is that it can't be fundamentally physical. And then we have this issue of, all right, does the fundamentally mental exist at the ground floor with the fundamentally physical already? That would be a panpsychism. Or can you get mentality emerging out of the physical? And then you have to say what emergence means. Or is the mental fundamentally not reducible to the physical, but it is only related to certain special kinds of physical things, and that's, like the brain. And then you get sort of Dave Chalmers non-reductive or property dualism. So all of those views, this is really the subject matter of the chapter on consciousness and the blind spot, all of those views are working with concepts that are part of the problem, not part of the solution. Now, I don't think we have a solution, but I think what it would take is a real revolution in our concepts and in our thinking, so that we have a view of nature that we don't bifurcate in terms of subject and object and mental and physical. And we don't exactly know how to do that scientifically yet. We we have some ideas that I think point us in that direction, which are that there's um, there's a unity of nature that allows for certain kinds of, you might say, singularities or discontinuous transitions, where processes individuate and self-individuate in various ways, so that we get life, we get animal cognition and so on, but we don't really know how to think about them in a non-oppositional or non-dualistic way, because the positions that were being offered, or idealism for that matter, where we decide, no, it's mind or experience or consciousness that's fundamental and primary, and matter is a derivative construction of that. These are all, for the most part, I mean, I'm being somewhat gross in my characterization, but for the most part, these are all still working within a framework of the bifurcation of nature. Now, I would say that we do have thinkers, scientists and philosophers, who saw this and then really devoted their efforts to trying to present a different way of understanding, either in philosophical or scientific terms. So Whitehead was certainly somebody who did this. Whitehead is often described as a panpsychist today, but I think that's a mistake. He never uses the word panpsychist. He's sometimes described as a pan-experientialist. That's not a word he uses. He's really concerned with trying to understand the physical, or you might even say the energetic, in a way where it would make sense to see mind as something that would be mind in the more familiar, biological sense, as something that would be a natural elaboration of that. And he's struggling with concepts and vocabularies, constructing them in the way that a mathematician does. He was a mathematician. He's trying to work out a system where this would make sense. David Bohm in physics in the 20th century, very much concerned to do the same thing with ideas of order and information that would be neither mental nor physical, but the mental and the physical, as we operationalize them in our experience and in our investigation, would be sort of natural outgrowths of something that would be more neutrally characterized or more fundamental. So those are the thinkers, I think, who really have their sort of eye on the prize, if you want to put it that way. Rather than the alternatives on offer of, panpsychism, emergentism, and so on.
Okay. So let's bring Buddhism back in here and Asian philosophy, just to offset this risk of conceptual constructs. I mean, it is so easy for us Western thinkers academic, reason-based, logic-based approaches to be forced to have to isolate one concept from the larger system just in order to make it work in the context of those few relations we can consider altogether. Now, your mentor and friend, Varela, co-founded the Mind and Life Institute with Adam Engel in 1987 in collaboration with the Dalai Lama to explore this intersection between Buddhism and cognitive science, because both of them believed that the two fields could help each other understand better the fundamental nature of reality, of mind, of the self. And over the years, you were heavily involved because there were some really useful overlaps. But in the end, your concerns about the overstating of those connections, with both sides looking to justify their own perspectives, led you to sort of pull back a bit from these rich dialogues and write the book, Why I'm Not a Buddhist. So let's start, Evan, with these useful overlaps. Many years after the Embodied Cognition book, which was clearly drawing on Buddhism, many years after all the studies of the brain science of meditation, all these debates about the importance of meditation and mystical experience to get insight into the true nature of mind and reality. So much water has passed under the bridge since the founding of that organization. Where have you landed on what really are the useful insights of cognitive science can get from studying Buddhism and meditation before we get on to the limitations?
Yeah, so that's a bit of a long story, I suppose, in the sense that, so going back to the embodied mind, the role that that Buddhism played in the embodied mind was we argued that there needed to be a kind of rigorous phenomenological investigation that would complement the cognitive scientific investigation of mind, a rigorous phenomenological investigation of mind that would complement the cognitive scientific one. And we looked to the Buddhist tradition for that because, really, for two reasons. One, because it had concrete phenomenological practices in the form of meditation or a certain kind of meditation. And the other is that it had a very developed philosophical tradition, really many developed philosophical traditions in its evolution, over millennia and centuries in India, China, and Tibet, and now in the West as well. So we saw it as an important dialogue partner for cognitive science to deal really with the emergence in cognitive science of statements like, well, the self is a construction, or there is no permanent enduring self, or action is always proceeding under the influence of many factors. And so the idea that there's some kind of central executive directing action, that's an illusion. Cognitive science was presenting these things to us, but with no real connection back to, okay, well, what does that mean for our experience as human beings? How do we deal with this? So we look to Buddhism for that. And then we drew on Buddhist ideas in articulating the enactive approach. So the idea of dependent origination that you mentioned earlier, the idea that things originate in an interrelational dependent way so that nothing really has an independent self-standing substance of its own. Its nature is it is what it is because of its interrelation to other things in a kind of causal network. So those are the ideas that played a role in the embodied mind. Then, so that was all really prior to the formation of the Mind and Life Institute, or maybe the book was published right around the time that the Mind and Life Institute was starting with its initial conversations between Western scientists and the Dalai Lama. But those were not public gatherings at that point. They were just small private meetings. And the idea there was that we have these, two very developed traditions of interest in understanding the nature of the mind, the tradition of Western science and then the tradition of Buddhist meditation and philosophy. And can they talk to each other? What do they have to say to each other? What can they learn from each other? That was really the motivation initially. And some of the dialogues over the years very much lived up to that idea that if you have two traditions that will talk to each other, they can catalyze changes in each other, and maybe they can even create new sort of hybridized conceptual conceptual formations, experiential practices that would be unique and suitable for our own time here and now, rather than, Tibet in the 15th century, or Western science in the 18th or 19th century. And so sometimes the dialogues really did rise, I think, to that level. But sometimes the dialogues would, from my perspective anyway, devolve into a kind of, well, what can we legitimize in Buddhism from a scientific perspective? Or, and then we'll just throw out the rest. Or what can we justify as Buddhists on the Buddhist side using science? And that is a kind of flattening of the conversation into basically, in effect, taking science for granted as the reference point, and not allowing the two traditions to really have a kind of open, no holds barred, free for all interaction with each other. So that you got, after Varela had died and was really no longer a presence in these conversations, because he was quite sensitive to these things, you got the dialogue between the two traditions basically being channeled into the effort to study meditation operationally in the lab, to find, neural correlates of changes to attention brought about by meditation that would be, beneficial, measured in terms of health outcomes. You got a
Individualistic.
yeah, you got a, sort of reduction of the conversation to making meditation an object of study according to the norms of 21st century science embedded in a, capitalist consumerist society. And the problem with that is that the Buddhist tradition is quite radical in certain ways. Like if you really inhabit the conceptual system of Buddhism from within, in terms of why it's motivated to try to understand the mind and why it taxonomizes mental phenomena in the way that it does, it's driven by a strong, normative agenda that, ultimately has to do with the Buddhist conception of awakening or enlightenment or liberation, and that often involves, a very critical perspective on the sort of default assumptions in science that science is just, a value-free, neutral way of getting at what the fundamental structure of reality is, the blind spot. So over the years of my involvement in the dialogues, I became concerned with what I eventually came to call Buddhist exceptionalism, which is the idea that, oh, well, Buddhism is sort of uniquely suited for this scientific project because, well, it really isn't a religion. It's a mind science or a therapy or a philosophy or a way of life. And that kind of statement just involves so many misunderstandings about what Buddhism is in all of its richness, what religion is, what science is. Religion gets reduced to a matter of, beliefs that you either then verify or disqualify using science. Is a very sort of Protestant conception of religion that is not sensitive to what religion is as a human cultural phenomenon across many societies and epochs. So I found myself in this situation where the ways of thinking about science and religion and Buddhism all fell into this category of what historians call Buddhist modernism. And this is the idea that, oh, Buddhism isn't really religion, and what Buddhism is really about is meditation. And this is kind of a modern conceit. Buddhism is a religion under any sort of scholarly definition of the term. It's not a theistic religion in the sense that Judaism, Christianity, or Islam is, but it is a religion structured in terms of religious norms. It's not about just meditation. The way we think of meditation is probably a more recent kind of modern rendering of Buddhism. Historically, Buddhism would involve all sorts of other things besides meditation. And it has this incredibly rich intellectual tradition with conceptual construction happening all the time. So it's not as if you have West conceptual construction and logic and Buddhism, no concepts, meditation. No, that's like a completely false and distorting picture of what's going on. You have an evolving intellectual tradition that's trying to make sense of the world, and it does that through creating concepts and discourses and debates and all of the things that happen in Western philosophy and Western science. So I basically my book Why I'm Not a Buddhist was written as an attempt to sort of just clarify all of that.
Hmm.
And
Can I just
yeah,
zoom in on one point there, Evan, which is this really crucial one that I think comes out very, very clearly in most people's experience of meditation. So, the very basic idea of allowing your thoughts to pass, the analogy is like a cloud passing through the sky. So, instead of saying, okay, that's me thinking and those are my thoughts, we imagine that it's a bit like a cloud passing in the sky and we just observe the thought as it passes, and then we return to having a still mind. And this is quite a well-known transcendental meditation approach, very suitable for Westerners because it's so conceptual. And what that suggests is that the self that we are so attached to, my voice, my name, my style of formulating thoughts, my way of interacting with people, basically the voice in my head or the voice coming out of my face hole, that actually that isn't my true self. And I think that that probably is quite strong in the Buddhist philosophical approach to self, namely that all of our suffering is coming from our attachment to that particular sense of self, as well as being attached to many, many other things as well. That is quite closely related to the neuroscientific modern psychology approach to self, which sees the self as a kind of complex of different elements that come together, very similar to your autopoiesis idea, in order to survive, in order to be dynamically and successfully involved in the world. Surely there's something of use in there for us scientifically, given the fact that they've known this for so long.
yeah, I would say that idea, that we need to distinguish between the the passing thoughts or the passing emotions, the passing mental images, the contents of the mind, and awareness of them or witnessing of them. I would say that is actually a pan-Indian idea. It's not exclusively Buddhist. You would find Hindu versions of that idea. You would find Jain versions of that idea. Then you have different articulations philosophically within India as to what the meaning of that is. Buddhists generally say there is no self, there is just the passing mental events, and the impression of self is an illusion. And Hindu thinkers will say there is a self that is consciousness itself, distinct from the awareness, distinct from the contents of the awareness.
Shit.
And so that's actually a kind of metaphysical dispute that science doesn't actually resolve one way or the other, because there's just philosophical questions embedded in that science isn't really the right tool for answering, and because it's also a normative question. It has to do with what is the proper way to look at things for the sake of liberation, and what does liberation actually consist in, which the Buddhists and Hindus would disagree about as well. You can, from a neuroscience perspective or cognitive science perspective, talk about the self as a construct, as a construction, in the sense of the self is not a thing; it's a process or entity that comes together through different mental and physical activities, and the impression that there is one single abiding unchanging thing, that would be an illusion. You can certainly render that in a cognitive science vocabulary. So there is a possibility of conversation there, definitely, between, let's say, Indian philosophical frameworks for understanding the mind and consciousness and self, and scientific ones. That's actually the theme, really, of my book, Waking, Dreaming, Being, is to go through that across the various changing states of consciousness. Waking, dreaming, lucid dreaming, and sleep. So yes, absolutely, there are things that both sides can say to each other, and ways that the discussion can be enriched for both on that topic, certainly.
There is another shadow with this whole thing, particularly about the benefits of meditation narrative and its commercialization by the well-being industry, because it further isolates the practitioner in their ego self, right? I mean, this works against the objective of the dissolution of the ego mind. It also cuts them off from the ritual, social, and collective side of meditation that you draw attention to. Is there, Evan, a sort of new age? Well, is this new age appropriation of Asian wisdom traditions actually causing a rebound of kind of actually increasing this kind of spiritual narcissism and making it worse rather than better?
I think definitely sometimes, and in some places, yes, that certainly happens, because you have a consumerist society that commodifies spirituality and commodifies meditation. This has been going on, for a long time in the West, long by Western standards. That is to say, 100 years or so. This has been something that's been happening, and of course, it's particularly acute now with the the large scale structural problems with isolation and loneliness, and corporatization of human life and behavior, and then trying to sort of fit meditation into that as a way of making people feel better with a structure that's fundamentally alienating. So I mean, that is absolutely something that is a phenomenon. That's what the word, Mick mindfulness is sort of meant to signify, is the co-option or the consumerization of ideas of transformation and liberation within a narcissistic, individualistic frame. There's no question that, or let me put it this way, I wouldn't want us to confuse that, which I think is definitely a phenomenon, with the benefits that also at the same time come from secularizing some of these aspects of meditation practice. I think things like mindfulness-based cognitive therapy and mindfulness-based stress reduction, these have been very beneficial to people in the context of, say, mental health and depression relapse or chronic pain. So I'm not in any way an modern, anti-secular person who wants to say, that traditional is good and modern is bad. That wouldn't be my point of view at all. I do think there are benefits that come from secularizing certain aspects of meditation and making them available in these ways. At the same time, though, I think the idea that this sort of naive New Age idea that you can transform the world by sitting on your cushion and generating, positive affect and compassion is, I mean, it might make you a better person, but that has virtually no effect on the structural problems that have to do with, climate change and capitalism and gross inequities of wealth and things like that. Those can't be addressed in terms of individual meditation practice. That's just a confusion of levels of a system.
And for me, I think all this focus on individualism. So it's like, okay, I think there's also now in the mental health discussion, very interesting that you mention it, because there are so many benefits coming out of this research that's really, really helping people, and they're non-drug based. They're things that don't cost a fortune. So, they're definitely having a great influence. But the responsibility is being pushed back onto the individual and away from
Mhm.
the collective. And it's all like, okay, this is your job. You have to control your social media use. You have to make sure you get enough exercise. You have to go off and research all of these clever new ways to make yourself feel better in this completely dysfunctional system. And I feel that that's pulling away from this social collective side of these traditions, which you constantly pull the attention back and you're saying, no, this is meditation is a ritual, social, collective activity. And that's why it creates such a great feeling in the group. And I wondered if there wasn't a connection here to all the connection research. So connection to nature, connection, social connection, connection to a sense of meaning and importance in your life. All of these things have been shown to be hugely important to the metrics of mental health and a sense of belonging in the world. What do you think here? Is it possible that we need to sort of de-individualize this sort of quite mystical, almost psychedelic understanding of the meditating mind on its journey to, to a unity with the cosmos and come back to this slightly more enacted understanding of like, we live in community, in connection with nature, with a desperate need to belong amongst a set of ideas?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that many of the problems and challenges we face are really fundamentally social ones, and social transformation happens through new social practices, and those also ritual can play a very important part in that. And historically, or not even just historically, but I would say that meditation practice, even in an individual way, is always in some sense ritualistic, if you're thinking of the way an anthropologist would understand ritual. In other words, it involves repeatedly bringing something into being according to a script and an understanding of what you're doing in a setting, and that setting might be relatively more isolated or it might be relatively more connected, but that is what ritual fundamentally is. And many of the positive transformative effects of meditation in terms of the scientific study of meditation, um, those may very well have to do with social ritual aspects of the practice and not with things that you would be able to operationalize at just an individual level. So I absolutely think that the social ritual frame is really important, and an enactive approach would definitely emphasize that. I mean, because yeah, I mean, going back to what you said earlier about you know recognizing the thought as a passing thought and not identifying with it, that actually is a form of internalized social cognition. In other words, you're able to view your own mind as a mind with changing contents from a perspective that's differentiated from it. That's something that we learn to do as human beings. Psychologists talk about this as metacognition, the ability to have cognition of cognition, and that arises developmentally through interacting with other human beings when we're babies. So that sort of you know mindful mindfulness or metacognitive monitoring is actually a social cognitive process in terms of the architecture of the mind already. So I think the social perspective is crucial.
And it's also enacted because it's only when our senses give us something, a stimulus from outside, in this case, the idea of the cloud passing across the sky. You can't imagine, Evan, how many of my guests speak about their childhood experiences of seeing rays of light with dust passing through it. And that got them thinking about the nature of
Mm-hmm.
consciousness and the cosmos and other worlds and all these amazing thoughts we have when we're children, often stimulated by very basic uh,
Mm-hmm.
interactions with the natural world. Okay, well, Evan, I must quickly, before I get on to the last question, I want to come back to dependent origination for a moment. It seems to me, and again, I just want to get that because we got onto this idea of self and the difference between the Hindu approach, obviously many traditions inside Hinduism as well, and the Buddhist approach. It seems to me, I don't have much of experience of meditation, but when I was playing with that particular approach, it seemed to me that myself wasn't the voice. It wasn't my trail of thought. It wasn't my name. It seemed to me that the self was actually the watcher. the observer. And I wondered if you could just explain how Asian philosophy lands on this particular question.
Mm.
Is that, I don't know, the soul? How do they treat this in this very rich debate that went on for thousands of years between the Hindu traditions and Buddhism?
Yeah, I mean, that really fundamentally depends on who you ask. So I would say that in the tradition of philosophy, that would be the yoga tradition or the Sankhya yoga tradition. The the watching or witnessing consciousness is understood to be a fundamentally unchanging and eternal, abiding, pure consciousness that transcends the natural world, the physical world. That is a sort of an outside watcher. That would be classically how they would articulate that. Um, uh, Other traditions would say that it's really just a cognitive function in the mind, that there's an aspect of the mind that enables it to monitor other aspects of the mind, and that comes and goes and changes and is impermanent and flows. And that would be how certain Buddhists would describe it. And so it would be an illusion to think that it's a kind of permanent, unchanging, essential or pure consciousness. Um, but there are other traditions within Buddhism that would say there's an unchanging or invariant self-awareness or reflexivity that belongs to consciousness that is intensified um, through certain kinds of, or is brought to the fore, let's say, in certain kinds of witnessing experiences. And it is the sort of ground energy state of all being. So it really, I mean, these are philosophical. They're also, you could say they're philosophical differences. They're also, doctrinal differences, and they run across the Indian religious and philosophical traditions.
But they're all mostly taking for granted the idea of reincarnation. So my question would be, does that watching self survive death into the next incarnation? And obviously the objective of release, enlightenment, is to not be brought back into that sort of cycle.
So all of the classical Indian traditions, except the materialists, would say that there is an aspect of the mind or of consciousness that continues to exist from one life to the next, from one biological life to the next, and that would be described in terms of rebirth or reincarnation, a kind of mental carryover from one life to the next, and the carryover would be consciousness with its capacity for awareness or witnessing, along with, you could say, traces or repositories of experiences had in previous lives. So they would all agree uh, on that. They would describe how it works and the metaphysics underlying it in different ways. Because for Hindus, there's a eternal, abiding, pure consciousness that you could call the true self, and Buddhists would deny that there is such a thing. But they would all agree on the rebirth cosmology, and then liberation is or entails freedom from the involuntary compulsory rebirth process. They would also all agree on that.
And would the Buddhists, coming back to the dependent origination idea, this long chain of causation, this massive network of intercausation, from which we can't extract any one phenomenon or any one being or any one cognitive watcher in this case, could we say that the Buddhist final position is to say that actually beyond that the watcher itself is an illusion in the sense that it is not actually separate from all of those other causes it is intricately connected to through that chain of causation? Is that what they mean when they say it's an illusion?
Again, that's going to depend on which Buddhist you ask, because there are a lot of Buddhist views across India, Tibet, and China that are going to say somewhat different things about that. Um, Dependent origination is basically the idea that to put it in technical Buddhist language, any conditioned phenomenon, so any phenomenon that depends for its existence on causes, conditions, and you might say constituents, like having parts, that all conditioned phenomena lead to other conditioned phenomena, except in the case of awakening, there is a liberation from conditioned phenomena. So that awakening or enlightenment is called the unconditioned, nirvana, actually. So nirvana, the extinguishing of craving and attachment, that's said to be unconditioned. So it has a different status. But what nirvana is, or how to describe nirvana, that's going to depend on who you ask. So some will describe it as a kind of um, cessation, and nothing really positive can be said about it. Others will describe it as the true fundamental nature of mind, as the liberation into the pure, clear, light nature of mind. Um, so, the Buddhists themselves don't have one view on this.
Well, and they also worked hugely with sort of opponent debate. Like a lot of the
Absolutely. Yeah.
progress is due to the richness of those debates and the readiness of those philosophers to engage in other thinkers in India. It's just an extraordinary melting pot, that particular time and that bulk of philosophy. Now, Evan, I appreciate that we don't have much time left, so I just want to close by thanking you so much for going into so much depth here. It's really wonderful to get such a well versed Buddhist scholar to talk about Buddhist in the context of cognitive science. So it's been an absolute joy. And I just want to wrap it up because I know you're working on a book about death. And in this series, the Jungian analyst and dreams of the dying specialist, Monica Wickman, we're doing an episode called On Facing Death. And we're definitely
Hmm.
going to be drawing on some of the Asian ideas about sort of conscious dying practices, particularly coming out of the sort of Tibetan Book of the Dead. But there are many, many elements coming out of different traditions on this. Tell us a little bit about what's the scope of the book. I'm imagining you're going to touch on a few of those things
Hmm.
and why you've chosen to write it.
Yeah. So the book is called Dying Our Ultimate Transformation.
I'm glad you stayed with
And
that title. It's a very good title.
thank you. Um, it's really about or let's say the premise and motivation of the book is the rather schizoid situation we are facing in our contemporary scientific culture, where on the one hand, we've never known more about dying and death from a biomedical perspective, from a biological perspective, but at the same time, we've never been more culturally removed from the dying process, and we hide it away in all sorts of ways. And what I'm interested in is bringing a phenomenological perspective that's richly informed by contemplative practices of lucid dying, or of mindful dying, conscious dying, bringing that perspective into collaboration and exchange with what we are learning about dying and death from the neuroscience of consciousness and from the biomedical study of death. So that's sort of the overarching aim of the book. And along the way, I look at I draw on a wide range of different things, from the literature of death to narratives and memoirs about dying from dying people or from hospice workers, uh, material in the philosophy of death about the nature of death, the relationship of, say, death in a traditional sense of the stopping of the heart and lungs to death understood as the death of the brain, um, arguing that death is actually something that, in a way, science can't actually tell us what death is, because death is a human social construct, like what we consider death to be. How we treat the death of a person or the death of a body depends on background values and social practices. So those are the things that I'm working with in the book. The book is still it's been slow writing, slower than I had originally planned or hoped for. So the book is still in, say, the early, not maybe not early, but in the mid stages of writing. And so it's still kind of an evolving work in progress. But those are the kinds of themes and materials that I'm dealing with. Yeah.
Well, I can certainly recommend that you look into the work of Monica Wickman.
I
Uh,
know her work. Yeah.
oh, you
Yeah.
do?
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, just this enormous collection of dreams and
Hmm.
how that she's collected from people who are in the process of approaching death. She herself has survived death on two very extraordinary stories. And
Hmm.
I think that there's a message here about this idea that approaching death is actually a transformative opportunity, the possibility to sort of not only to face the sort of physical reality of what it means to have to let go of everything you've accumulated in terms of your attachments, if we're looking at it in a Buddhist sense, but also what you're going back to. And I can't help thinking of this African approach to death. Actually, it was sort of more of the old animist African religious approaches where they see it as a circle. And we have the ancestors, which is this kind of huge cauldron, a bit like the collective unconscious, where we have all of this possibility from the past and from the future. So we're talking about a sort of cauldron of return, where we have all of this ancestral knowledge. So it's also about knowledge. Monica Galliano spoke about this in terms of our plants, that in a sense, they've been the ones that have been around for so long. It's almost in a sense, even bacteria and viruses, in a sense, have this sort of ancient wisdom as our most ancient ancestors. I just feel that in some sense, we've become dislocated from this cauldron that we emerged from and that we go back to. As Jung said it, everything before and after death is a complete mystery. And it seems kind of arrogant to dismiss that as just, oh, well, that's just what happens to a body and, that's it. It seems very typically reductionist, actually.
Yeah, I agree completely. I think that we have, culturally speaking, we have cut ourselves off from a lot of modes of experience and ways of thinking that we need to deal with dying and death. And I think we also need to deal with it on a cultural level. I mean, we are arguably undergoing, in the form of the climate crisis, a kind of dying in the sense of the need for a transformation that fundamentally alters who and what we are and how we relate to each other, being in and on the planet. And that's a kind of dying too.
But even if we think about mass extinctions of the past, look at populations.
Oh yeah.
Fortunately, it's very rare that that population sees the errors of its ways.
Well,
It
that's
just goes, it goes, and goes, and then nature itself is the thing to come in and
yeah,
and cause the
absolutely.
extinction event. I can't say I'm hugely enthusiastic about the possibility that we can see that. I mean, we've got all the tools to know exactly
Yeah.
what's going to happen. It's not like we haven't seen all of the
Right.
massive extinction events from the past. We've even managed to map it back to the last 5 extinction events. It's
Yeah.
not changing a thing about what we're doing, right?
No, no, it isn't, and one can become, quite pessimistic. I mean, I think it's an open question. I think I don't think it's by any means decided or determined yet. But it is indeed true that, I mean, in some larger temporal sense, of course, extinction, is inevitable because everything dies in that sense. In terms of the more imminent temporal horizon, it's an open question, I think. Yeah.
Also, maybe there's not such a need to be so pessimistic. If we did see, what Monica called deep time, Monica Galliano, she was talking about these ridiculous time scales that nature works on. And yeah, okay, maybe our particular civilization will die, but I don't see that as such a pessimistic thing. I just see it, if I look at it from a deep time point of view, that it's just an organized, self-organizing system regenerating. Is that so bad? I'm not sure.
Well, I would distinguish between, the human form of life and the particular form of our civilization now. So I would like to hold out the thought and the hope that we don't identify the particular civilization we've constructed for ourselves now with the possibilities of human existence more generally. In other words, I think a civilizational transformation is absolutely needed uh, in order for the human project in relationship to the rest of nature to continue. So there does need to be a transformation and a dying, I think, and whether that will happen or whether it will be something much more extreme is, that I think is an open question. Yeah.
Absolutely fascinating, Evan. Well, listeners, when it comes out, you must go out and get this. I think you said it's called Death or Dying, the Ultimate
Dying, yeah.
Transformation.
Our ultimate transformation, right? So it probably still won't be out for a couple of years because I'm still in the process of finishing the writing. But yeah,
Evan Thompson, it's been an absolute joy to meet you on behalf of all the listeners. Thank you so much for your time, and I wish you all the best.
thank you very much.